The phone call came early on the morning of May 24, 1974. Ella Fitzgerald was at home in Beverly Hills when Virginia Williams knocked on her bedroom door, her face already telling the story before she spoke. "Duke is gone," Virginia said quietly. Ella sat up slowly. She'd known this was coming. Duke Ellington had been ill for months, his health declining rapidly, but knowing and hearing are different things. She was 57 years old, and Duke had been part of her life for nearly 40 of those years. When, Ella asked, her voice steady but small, "This morning, pneumonia, his son was with him." Ella nodded, didn't cry, not yet, the tears would come later. Right now she just felt heavy, like the world had lost something it couldn't replace. This is the story of what happened 10 days later when 10 people gathered at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City for Duke Ellington's funeral. Of the moment everyone in that vast cathedral waited for Ella Fitzgerald to sing, of how she walked to the microphone carrying 40 years of friendship and grief, and of the 3 minutes that followed when a song became a goodbye, when perfection mattered less than truth, and when silence said more than any applause ever could. Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald had first met in the mid-1930s, when Ella was still a teenager singing with Chick Webb's orchestra, and Duke was already an established bandleader whose sophistication had elevated jazz into art. "You have something special," he'd told her after hearing her sing. "Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are." She'd never forgotten that. They'd recorded together multiple times over the decades. Fitzgerald sings the Duke Ellington Songbook. In 1957 had been one of her most challenging projects. Duke's compositions required both technical precision and emotional depth. Duke had attended several recording sessions, offering gentle suggestions, trusting Ella's interpretive instincts. But more than professional collaboration, they developed genuine friendship. Duke had mentored Ella when she was young and uncertain. She'd trusted his musical judgment above almost anyone else's. They'd spent countless hours talking about music, about life, about the strange experience of being black artists achieving mainstream success in a country that didn't always want to see them succeed. Duke understood things about Ella's life that few others could. The pressure of being exceptional when people were looking for any reason to dismiss you, and Ella understood. Duke's complexity, the elegant public persona that masked private struggles, the perfectionism that drove him. 40 years of that, of mutual support, musical collaboration, honest friendship between two artists who transformed American culture. Duke had called her 2 weeks before he died. His voice was weak, but he'd wanted to hear about her recent performances. At the end, Duke had said something unusual. "Ella, you've been one of the great gifts of my life. I want you to know that." "Duke, don't talk like that," she'd protested, though her throat had tightened. "I'm just stating facts," he'd said. "Thank you for the music, thank you for the friendship." When they'd said goodbye, Ella had known it might be the last time. Now he was gone, and the music world was preparing to say goodbye. The funeral was scheduled for May 27, 1974 at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, one of the largest churches in the world, massive enough to hold the crowds that would come to pay respects. Duke's family was planning a service worthy of the man, music, tributes, recognition of a life that had transformed American culture. 2 days after Duke died, Ella received a call from his son, Mercer Ellington. "Miss Fitzgerald," he said, his voice formal despite the grief, "my father would want you to sing. Everyone wants you to sing. Would you be willing?" Ella's throat tightened. "Of course, whatever you need. Choose whatever song feels right to you. My father trusted your judgment completely." After she hung up, Ella sat in her music room for a long time, thinking about what song could possibly capture 40 years of friendship, of musical collaboration, of mutual respect and genuine affection. The answer came to her almost immediately. Solitude, one of Duke's most personal compositions, a song about loneliness, about isolation, about the spaces between people, but also a song Duke had written with such beauty that it transformed sadness into art. It felt right. It felt like the only possible choice. The morning of the funeral, Virginia helped Ella dress in a simple black dress and hat. Ella was quiet, had been quiet for days. Virginia had known her for decades and recognized this silence, not absence but preparation. Ella gathering herself for something difficult. "You don't have to do this," Virginia said gently. "If it's too hard, no one would judge you." "I have to," Ella said simply. "For Duke and for myself, I need to say goodbye properly." They flew to New York that afternoon. Cathedral of St. John the Divine was already filling when they arrived, thousands streaming in hours before the service, musicians and fans who'd loved Duke's music for decades. Ella entered through a side entrance, avoiding the crowds and press. Inside, the cathedral was overwhelming, vast stone arches soaring upward, stained glass filtering light into pools of color, the sense of space and history almost crushing. Count Basie stood near the front pews, his usually jovial face grave. When he saw Ella, he walked over and embraced her without a word, just held her, two old friends who'd lost another. Sarah Vaughan sat crying even though the service was hours away. When Ella approached, they held each other. "I don't know how to do this," Sarah whispered. "How do we say goodbye to Duke?" "We sing," Ella said quietly. "It's all we know how to do." Dizzy Gillespie, Tony Bennett, Benny Goodman, the cathedral filled with musicians who looked lost. Because Duke had been the elder statesman and now he was gone. Mercer Ellington came over, his eyes red. "He loved you," Mercer said simply. "He talked about you often, about your artistry, your friendship." "I loved him too," Ella managed. The brief rehearsal with Billy Taylor established tempo and feel. "Should I follow you?" Billy asked. "Follow me," Ella said. "I don't know how this will go. I might need space." Billy nodded, understanding. This wasn't about perfect execution. The service began at 3 p.m. Duke's casket was positioned at the front of the cathedral, covered in flowers. Mercer Ellington sat in the front row with family members, and slowly the cathedral filled to capacity, 10-0 people inside. Thousands more standing outside. There were speeches first, tributes from political figures, from fellow musicians, from people whose lives Duke had touched. Each one honest, heartfelt, trying to capture what Duke Ellington had meant to American music and culture. But everyone was waiting for the music, because Duke was music. Words could only go so far. Several performances were scheduled. A pianist played Mood Indigo. A saxophonist performed Sophisticated Lady. Each one beautiful, each one a tribute, but the program everyone was watching for was listed simply: Ella Fitzgerald, Solitude. When her time came, Ella stood from her pew. Virginia squeezed her hand once, and Ella walked alone down the center aisle toward the front of the cathedral. 10,000 people watched her walk. The cathedral went completely silent, just her footsteps echoing on stone floors and the sound of thousands of people breathing. She reached the microphone that had been set up near Duke's casket, stood there for a moment, looking at the flowers, at the physical reality of her friend's death. The pianist, Billy Taylor, who'd worked with Duke for years, sat waiting at the grand piano positioned nearby. He looked at Ella, and she gave a small nod. Billy began playing the introduction to Solitude. Slow, contemplative, giving the melody the space it needed. The notes filled that vast cathedral, and everyone who knew the song recognized it immediately. Ella took a breath, closed her eyes, and began to sing. "In my solitude you haunt me." Her voice cracked on the very first line. Not from technical failure, Ella's technique was still flawless at 57, but from emotion too large to contain. She was crying before she finished the first phrase, tears already streaming down her face. But she kept singing, because stopping would have been worse, with reveries of days gone by. Every word felt personal, felt like she was talking directly to Duke, to the casket in front of her, to 40 years of memories flooding through her all at once, the first time they'd met, recording sessions where Duke had conducted with such precision. Late-night conversations about music and life, his voice on the phone 2 weeks ago already fading. In the pews, Sarah Vaughan put her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Count Basie's usual stoic expression had crumbled. He was openly weeping, not bothering to hide it. Dizzy Gillespie had turned away, unable to watch without breaking down completely. Cathedral's acoustics were extraordinary. Ella's voice, even broken and crying, filled the massive space. Every crack, every tear-choked note, every moment of her voice nearly failing carried to the furthest pews. 10,000 people heard not just the song but the grief inside it. Ella's voice was breaking throughout, not from age, not from lack of skill, but from the impossibility of singing about solitude while standing next to the body of someone who'd made her life less solitary. The technical perfection she'd spent 60 years mastering was irrelevant now. This wasn't about singing correctly. This was about saying goodbye to someone she loved. "In my solitude, I'm praying." The line hung in the air like a question. Ella paused, taking a shaky breath, hand trembling at her side, tears flowing freely. She could barely see through them, but it didn't matter. She wasn't reading lyrics. She'd known this song for decades. Billy Taylor at the piano was crying too, but his hands kept moving steadily, kept providing the musical foundation Ella needed. He'd played with Duke for years, understood exactly what this moment meant. "Dear Lord above, send back my love." The lyric was almost too much. Ella's voice nearly broke completely on "Send back my love," the impossibility of that request, the childlike hope buried in grief. Several people in the front rows gasped audibly, the raw emotion cutting through them. Tony Bennett, sitting 10 rows back, would later say he'd never heard anything so powerful in his life. She wasn't performing, he'd tell people. She was bleeding musically. Every note was a wound. 10,000 people sat in complete silence, not the polite silence of an audience, the reverent silence of witnesses. Everyone in that cathedral understood they were experiencing something sacred, not a performance, a farewell. Ella reached the bridge of the song and her voice nearly failed completely. She stopped for a moment, hand going to her mouth, overwhelmed. Billy kept playing, giving her time. The cathedral waited, 10,000 people holding their breath. Ella lowered her hand, took a breath, and continued. Her voice was quieter now, more fragile, but somehow more powerful because of that fragility. Every note carried the weight of loss, of friendship, of 40 years compressed into 3 minutes of music. Sarah Vaughan had slid from her pew onto the floor, sitting there with her knees drawn up, crying so hard she couldn't maintain composure. Other musicians were holding onto pew backs, heads bowed. "In my solitude you taunt me." Ella was looking at Duke's casket as she sang, not at the audience, not at Billy, not at anything except the physical reminder that her friend was gone. The final verse approached. Ella's voice was barely holding together, but she pushed through, determined to finish what she'd started, with memories that never die. The last note hung in the cathedral's vast space. Billy played the final chord. And then there was silence, complete silence. Ella stood at the microphone, tears flowing freely, unable to move. Billy Taylor sat at the piano, head bowed, and 10-0 people sat in absolute stillness. No one applauded, not because the performance wasn't worthy of applause. It was one of the most powerful things anyone in that cathedral had ever witnessed. Because applause felt wrong, felt like it would diminish what had just happened. This wasn't entertainment. This was grief made audible. This was friendship expressed through the only language that felt adequate, music. The silence lasted 30 seconds, 40, a minute, 10,000 people saying nothing, feeling everything. Finally, Ella turned from the microphone and walked back down the aisle. People reached out as she passed, not to stop her, just to touch her hand, her arm, offering wordless comfort and gratitude. When she reached her pew, Virginia pulled her into an embrace, and only then did Ella's composure completely break. She sobbed into Virginia's shoulder while the service continued around them. After the funeral, musicians gathered outside the cathedral. Many came to Ella, wanting to thank her, to tell her what her performance had meant. Count Basie hugged her without saying anything. Sarah Vaughan whispered, "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Tony Bennett said quietly, "Duke would have loved that, not because it was perfect, because it was true." And that was exactly right. Ella's performance of Solitude at Duke Ellington's funeral wasn't technically perfect. Her voice had cracked, broken, nearly failed multiple times. By conventional performance standards, it was flawed. But it was also the truest thing she'd ever sung. Every crack in her voice was honest. Every tear was real. Every note carried genuine grief for a genuine friendship. In the days after the funeral, several people had recorded the service. Bootleg tapes circulated among musicians, not for commercial purposes, but because people wanted to remember, wanted to hold on to that moment. When Ella heard that recordings existed, she asked that they not be widely distributed. That was for Duke, she said, not for the world. Most people respected that wish. The performance remained something whispered about among musicians, a moment of profound artistry that few outside that cathedral had experienced, but those who'd been there never forgot it. 20 years later, when Ella died, many of the obituaries mentioned her Grammy Awards, her songbook series, her 6-decade career of technical excellence. But musicians interviewed about her legacy often brought up that funeral. "I've heard Ella sing hundreds of times," one jazz musician said, "but the most powerful performance I ever witnessed was at Duke's funeral, because that day she wasn't trying to be perfect. She was trying to say goodbye, and she did it through the only language that felt big enough, music." Sarah Vaughan, in an interview shortly before her own death, talked about that day. "Ella singing Solitude while crying, I still can't talk about it without crying myself. It showed me that the greatest artistry isn't about technical perfection. It's about emotional truth." Ella gave Duke the gift of her vulnerability, her grief, her love. What more could anyone ask for? The Cathedral of St. John the Divine has hosted countless services over its long history. but people who were there that day in 1974 say they've never experienced anything quite like those 3 minutes when Ella Fitzgerald sang through her tears. The performance has taken on legendary status among musicians, not because of how well she sang, but because of what she expressed, the grief of losing a friend. Weight of 40 years of collaboration and respect, the impossibility of saying adequate goodbye to someone irreplaceable. Solitude became forever connected to that moment. When musicians perform it now, they sometimes reference Ella's funeral performance, the definitive version, not because of technical mastery, but because of emotional honesty. Duke Ellington was buried later that day. The service ended, the crowds dispersed, and life continued. But something had happened in that cathedral that couldn't be quantified or easily explained. Ella Fitzgerald had given her friend a final gift, a song that acknowledged his absence, honored his memory, and demonstrated that their musical partnership had been about more than notes and rhythms. It had been about human connection, about two artists who'd recognized something essential in each other. Years later, Virginia Williams would share one detail about that day that she'd kept private. As they'd left the cathedral and gotten into the car, Ella had said quietly, "I hope he heard it. I hope somehow he knows I said goodbye." He knows, Virginia had assured her. Everyone in that cathedral knows. And that was true. 10,000 people had witnessed Ella Fitzgerald saying goodbye to Duke Ellington, not through words, not through perfection, but through music, broken, honest, grief-filled music that said what words never could. The song that needed no applause, the performance that was perfect precisely because it was imperfect. The 3 minutes when artistry and friendship and loss and love all became the same thing. That was Ella's final gift to Duke, and perhaps his final gift to her, the opportunity to show that music's greatest power isn't in technical excellence but in truth. Solitude, sung through tears, in a cathedral filled with witnesses, for a friend who'd shaped her life and career, a goodbye that no one who heard it could ever forget.